Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So this is going to be a PoetryTube bookish breakfast. I'm going to be talking about Learning to Make an Oud in Nazareth by Ruth Padel, which I finished this week. So Learning to Make an Oud in Nazareth was published in 2014 and shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is quite a prestigious poetry prize. And I first read it around that time, so around 2014, because I was handed it because a lot of it relates to the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics, Middle Eastern culture and themes, and that was something that I was developing an interest in at the time because I was starting to learn Arabic. To be honest, when I first read it, I really thought that she was a Levantine author from somewhere in the region. That's really not true. So she was born in London, and she, along with being a poet, she is a classicist, musician and wildlife conservationist, according to her website, which I will link below because I used it extensively in putting this together, this little review thing. So those interests really come through in all respects in terms of the classical references that she uses in her poems and the way that she works with metaphors of music and nature frequently. So she has spent a lot of time in Crete and in India, but she now lives in London, where she is Professor of Poetry at King's College, apparently. She seems like she would be a really good person to be taught poetry by as well. She was actually the first woman to be elected Professor of Poetry at Oxford, apparently very rightly so in terms of her poetic experience and abilities, but unfortunately she resigned almost immediately due to some very unpleasant media coverage that was around at the time. So the impression that I get from reading a little bit of her biography is that she is a very busy and active character with a lot of projects going on. One of these, of course, is being a pretty prolific author. So as well as poetry, she has done non-fiction and fiction. And one recent book that I thought looked particularly interesting that I wanted to mention is called We Are All From Somewhere Else, Migration and Survival in Poetry and Prose. So that apparently looks at recent migration patterns in the world and the impact of climate change, but mixes in, like it says in the title, poetry and prose to do that with. In the US, for some reason, it's called On Migration, and I think it's a slightly older version of the book. At times she has written about poetry itself, so in her book 52 Ways of Looking at a Poem, she presents a poem for every week of the year, based on a column that she used to write in The Independent on Sunday, and in it she apparently raises up a range of female poets whose work and whose voices have typically been viewed as less serious and valuable, and she talks about why that has been in terms of a male domination of poetry and analysis of poetry. She has also experimented with using poetry collections to create biographies of historical characters or fit her poetry in with musical events. So she's quite innovative in the ways that she works with poetry. Apparently, she is a descendant from Charles Darwin. I believe that she is his great-great-granddaughter. And he seems to have been a real influence on her life as well. So at one stage, she was researching for a non-fiction book on conservation with tigers, and she wrote, I realised as I was kayaking rather fearfully down a jungle river in Laos that while my great-great-grandfather's journey through similar terrain but on a different continent resulted in the understanding of how species came to be, my own journey was a quest to understand how species go extinct. So I thought that was quite interesting. Do you know, just kayaking fearfully down a river as you do, like that's totally cool. But anyway, so to talk now about this collection specifically, many of these poems see Ruth Padel seeking incidents from history or from modern news that can be used as framing devices for her poetic aims. So she crystallises those events or images into a few evocative lines and accompanies those with some kind of broader discussion in a sense of human nature, of the natures of the people surrounding those poems, I suppose, and what makes those incidents notable and resonant in terms of universal themes as well as being specific events. I find it interesting in this book how confidently she claims her right to write about an array of religions and cultures. So the blurb talks about how she brings together, is it on the blurb? Yeah. The common ground shared by Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and just sort of focuses on the Abrahamic religions. But she also weaves in a lot of other elements. I've mentioned already classical myth and other kind of religious and spiritual backgrounds, I suppose. They're all woven into the poetry that she uses. And she writes a lot about countries that seem very familiar to her as an authorial voice that can never have been really so familiar to her as a person. I think that's one of the reasons that I was convinced that she was from the area or had been based in the area for a significant length of time. Other than living in Crete, she, as far as I'm aware, hasn't spent a very long time in the countries that she's writing about. She deliberately uses a kind of regional voice in this way, where it kind of feels like she's from the area as opposed to one specific place. And it's like you couldn't tell her religion from this book, but the way that she writes about a range of religions, you really feel like it's something personal to her. So I found that very interesting. In a way, it's funny because I feel slightly duped that she isn't from there. And I have to wonder how somebody from a country like Syria, for instance, because Syria features a few times in these poems, would feel about the way that she handled the conflicts that they have experienced there. I'm not saying that her writing is in any way insensitive, as it's definitely exceptionally well handled and exceptionally interesting, and really makes you think about those conflicts, which is important. It's just a wonder that I have. But that said, she's also worked on collections of poetry from authors from the area. So, for instance, she has introduced collections of poetry by Palestinian authors like Mahmoud Darwish. So support for those voices from the area is definitely there. So, once again, trying to use a mouse that's not attached to the laptop. So a lot of this book, the poems focus around images of making and destruction. The final line of the book, which is the one that I see most quoted when I look this book up, is "Making is our defense against the dark." And that is definitely the message that she is, that kind of unites the poems through this collection, I suppose. So there is a lot of things being crafted and things being destroyed, or things being crafted based on things that were destroyed. So painters that are encouraged to, there's one about a painter who is encouraged to stop painting trivial things and start painting images of war, and like the reception of those images, even as they become increasingly dark, is increasing, the images are appreciated more, without people seeming to kind of appreciate the darkness within them in a way. That's called Peter the Silly One, I think it's called, if you wanted to read that one. The collection is bookended by two poems that draw on this theme very heavily. So Learning to Make an Oud in Nazareth, it's the first poem, and in that a man is lovingly constructing an oud when at a certain point he is interrupted by soldiers quite harshly. And in the final poem, Facing East, she stands on the coast of Britain next to a statue of a seashell that she weaves really beautifully into the poem, and mentally travels as